Every year, 12 million people visit the Statue of Liberty. They take the ferry from Battery Park. They go through security. They climb the steps. They look up at the green copper figure holding the torch. They take their photographs. They read the plaque about the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And then they get back on the ferry and go home. Not 1 in 1,000 of them looks down. Not 1 in 1,000 of them walks the perimeter of the structure on which the statue stands and counts the corners. Not 1 in 1,000 of them asks the question that changes everything about what they are looking at. Because if they did look down, if they did count the corners, if they did ask the question, they would find something that the National Park Service tour guides are not trained to explain. Something that the official history of the statue skips over in a single sentence. Something that has been hiding in plain sight at the entrance to New York Harbor for over 200 years, while 12 million tourists a year photograph the thing sitting on top of it without ever seeing what is underneath. The Statue of Liberty is built on top of an 11-pointed star fortification. Not a 5-pointed star, not a 6-pointed star. 11. A geometry that appears nowhere else in the entire documented history of American military engineering. A geometry that the engineer officially credited with designing it never used before and never used again in a career spanning decades and dozens of forts across the entire eastern seaboard. A geometry that has no military logic, no defensive purpose that justifies 11 points over 5 or 6. A geometry that does have a specific meaning in a completely different tradition entirely. And once you understand what that tradition is, once you understand who built the ceremony that dedicated this structure in 1884, once you understand what the torch and the crown and the tablet actually mean in the symbolic language of the people who designed them, the most famous statue in the world stops being a symbol of freedom and starts being something much older, much more specific, and much more deliberately placed than any official tour has ever told you. Let us start with the structure itself. The foundation on which the Statue of Liberty stands is called Fort Wood. The official story is that it was built between 1808 and 1811 by a young army engineer named Joseph Gilbert Totten as part of the coastal defense system the United States erected before the War of 1812. The island it sits on was called Bedloe's Island, after a Dutch colonist who owned it in the 17th century. After the war, the fort fell into disuse. By the 1870s, when the French began discussing the gift of a colossal statue, the walls were already there. A convenient pedestal. The statue was placed on top. End of story. Except it is not the end of the story. It is not even close to the end of the story. Because Joseph Gilbert Totten is a real and thoroughly documented figure. He graduated from West Point in 1805. He spent the rest of his career in the Army Corps of Engineers. He designed dozens of coastal fortifications across the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico. His designs are in the National Archives. His correspondence with the War Department fills multiple volumes. And in the entire documented body of his work, there is not a single structure that looks anything like Fort Wood. Fort Adams in Newport, Rhode Island, which Totten started in the 1820s, is a pentagonal bastion fort. Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia, started in 1819, is an irregular hexagon. Fort Macon in North Carolina is a 5-pointed star. Fort Pulaski in Georgia is a pentagonal casemated fort. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where Totten worked extensively, is a pentagonal masonry fort. 5 sides. 6 sides. The same straightforward geometry, the same conventional American military engineering, over and over and over again. And then there is Fort Wood. 11 points. A geometry that appears nowhere else in his career, that he never explained in any documented correspondence, that he never repeated in any subsequent design, that has no parallel in any other American military structure of the period. The same engineer who spent his entire career building pentagons and hexagons suddenly produced an 11-pointed star at Bedloe's Island, and then never did it again. No explanation, no notes, no record of why this one structure in this one harbour required a geometry so complex and so unusual that nothing like it exists anywhere else in American military history. The first thing that should make you stop and ask why. The second thing is the masonry. When you look at the walls of Fort Wood directly and compare them to other Totten projects of the same era, the difference is immediate. The walls of Fort Wood are constructed of cut granite blocks fitted with a degree of precision that is unusual for American military construction of the early 19th century. The corners are dressed with finished edges. The joints are tight. The stones are large, regular, and laid in courses that suggest decades of practice in master masonry. American military construction in the years before the War of 1812 was generally hurried. The Republic was young, the treasury was thin, the forts of the period were built quickly, with whatever labour and materials were available locally, and they show it. They are functional, but rough. They look like what they are, a young country building defences fast with limited resources. Fort Wood does not look like that. Fort Wood looks European. Specifically, it looks like the great star forts of the Netherlands and northern Italy and the German principalities. The tradition of fortification design that dominated European military architecture from the 16th through the 18th centuries. The kind of masonry that an established European tradition of professional military construction would produce. Not the kind that a young American republic with a thin treasury and a limited labour force would produce in 3 years on an island in New York Harbour in 1810. When you put a photograph of Fort Wood's walls next to a photograph of Fort Monroe, built by the same engineer at the same period, the contrast is not subtle. One looks American, one looks like it was already there. The third problem is the geometry itself, and this is where the story stops being about military history and starts being about something else entirely. 11-pointed stars are not standard military design. The classical bastion forts of the 17th and 18th centuries used 5, 6, 7, or 8 points. The Vauban tradition, which dominated European fortification design for over a century, almost never used geometries above 8 points, because there was no military reason to do so. Adding more points reduced the field of fire from each bastion, made the perimeter harder to garrison, complicated the supply lines. 11 points is, from a military engineering perspective, an irrational choice. It serves no defensive purpose that could not be served better with fewer points. No French engineer, no Dutch engineer, no English engineer designed 11-pointed star forts as a matter of standard military practice. So why does one exist at the entrance to New York Harbour? Because 11-pointed stars do appear with consistency in a completely different tradition. They appear in the architectural symbolism of specific European organizations. In the cosmological diagrams of Renaissance Hermeticists, in the floor designs of specific cathedrals, in the sacred geometry of certain initiatory traditions, in the Western esoteric tradition, the number 11 carries specific associations. It is the number of the threshold, the gate between worlds, the principle of mastery beyond the completion represented by 10. An 11-pointed star at the entrance to a major harbour is not a defensive statement, it is a symbolic statement, and someone placed it at the southern entrance to New York Harbour deliberately, before we get to who that someone was, we need to understand what they put on top of it. The Statue of Liberty, as Bartholdi designed her, is not the figure of liberty that Americans had previously imagined. The standard American iconography of liberty in the late 18th and early 19th centuries was Columbia, a female figure in classical robes, smaller in scale, more domestic in feeling. Bartholdi's figure is something entirely different. She is colossal. She wears a crown with 7 rays. She holds a torch above her head and a tablet under her arm. She faces outward toward the open ocean in the posture of a sentinel or a guardian. The closest historical parallel is not any American symbol of freedom. The closest historical parallel, by Bartholdi's own admission, is the Pharos of Alexandria, the great lighthouse of the ancient world, which was a colossal figure standing at the entrance to a major harbour, holding a light to guide ships. Bartholdi did not arrive at this design for the American project. He had developed it earlier for a completely different project. A colossal lighthouse figure at the entrance to the Suez Canal, depicting an Egyptian woman holding a torch. The Egyptian project was never built. He reused the design for America. The figure that stands in New York Harbor is in its origin and its iconographic lineage a lighthouse goddess, an ancient harbour guardian placed at the entrance to the most important harbour in the New World. And when you understand that the symbolic language she is speaking is the symbolic language of the ancient Mediterranean world, the 7-rayed crown, and the torch and the tablet stop being generic decoration and start meaning something specific. The 7-rayed crown is not a generic decorative element. In the iconographic tradition, Bartholdi was working in the 7 rays, correspond to the 7 planetary spheres of the older cosmological systems, the 7 rays of the older solar religions. The 7 hierarchical levels of certain initiatory traditions. The same 7 rays symbolism appears in depictions of the Roman Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, in depictions of the Mithraic mysteries, in the statue of the Colossus of Rhodes, which also stood at the entrance to a major harbour and also held a torch. The torch is illumination in the specific sense that the word was used in the European Illuminist movements of the 18th and 19th centuries. Not the ordinary light of a lighthouse, the light of revealed knowledge, the light of the mysteries made available to those prepared to receive it. The tablet, which every American tourist reads as a reference to the Declaration of Independence, carries in the older iconographic tradition the associations of the tablets of esoteric law, the laws of the mysteries transmitted from one initiatory generation to the next. None of this is speculation. It is documented in Bartholdi's own correspondence, in the writings of his collaborators, in the published statements of the organizations that funded and dedicated the monument. These associations were simply not part of the public-facing story that was told to the general population at the time of the dedication and have never been part of the public-facing story since. The organizations involved in building and dedicating the statue were not hiding their affiliations. They were open about them. Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi, the sculptor, was a Freemason. Édouard de Laboulaye, the French politician who originated the project, was a Freemason. Richard Morris Hunt, the American architect who designed the pedestal, was a Freemason. Gustave Eiffel, who designed the internal iron framework, was a Freemason. Joseph Pulitzer, who ran the public fundraising campaign, was a Freemason. The cornerstone of the pedestal was laid on August 5, 1884, by William Brodie, the Grand Master of Masons of the state of New York, in a public ceremony that followed the traditional Masonic ritual for the consecration of a public structure, Corn was scattered over the cornerstone, wine was poured, oil was poured. The cornerstone was struck 3 times with a mallet. This ceremony was not secret, it was reported in the newspapers of the day. It is a matter of public record. Hundreds of masons attended in formal regalia. The dedication of the statue itself 2 years later was similarly attended by Masonic dignitaries from across the country. The Masonic involvement in the project was not incidental, it was structural. The people who designed the monument chose its iconography from the symbolic vocabulary of their tradition. The people who dedicated the monument used the ritual forms of their tradition. The people who selected the site chose the site that already carried the geometric signature of that tradition. The 11-pointed star was not a coincidence, it was a recognition. The men who placed this statue understood what was already at Bedloe's Island and chose it for that reason. Now, here is where the story goes global. Because Fort Wood is not unique, it is one node in a network. Once you know what you are looking at, you start finding the same geometry, the same masonry, the same anomalous origin stories everywhere. In the Netherlands, in the small town of Bourtange, there is a star fort whose underlying foundations have never been properly excavated and whose alignment matches the Fort Wood alignment within a few degrees. In northern Italy, the city of Palmanova is built around a 9-pointed star with an inner ring of 18 bastions. In Hungary, at the town of Komárom, there are fortifications attributed to the Habsburgs, whose lower courses show stonework that predates Habsburg control of the region by centuries. Across the territory that the older European maps labelled Tartaria, there are dozens of star fortifications in remote regions with 11 and 12-pointed geometries, all officially attributed to 19th century Russian military construction.
None of them with documented construction records that hold up to examination.
In South America, the fortifications surrounding Cartagena de Indias on the Caribbean coast of Colombia are attributed to Spanish colonial construction in the 17th and 18th centuries. The lower courses of those fortifications show masonry that predates Spanish arrival in the region. The early Spanish colonial documents describe the structures as already existing when the Spanish arrived. The Spanish military engineers who incorporated them into the colonial defense system describe in their own archived reports in Seville a type and quality of construction that pointed to a culture of which the local people retained no memory. Already there, already built, already exhibiting the geometry and the masonry quality that would later be reattributed to named European engineers who simply walked into a landscape that someone else had already organized. This is the pattern that the official academic history of military architecture does not want assembled in one place. Star fortifications of complex geometry are not a phenomenon of late medieval and early modern European engineering. They are far older. They are far more widespread. The European engineers who took official credit for them in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries were in many cases not the builders. They were the inheritors. They found these structures. They refurbished them. They incorporated them into their military plans, and they wrote them up in their official reports as if they had designed them from scratch. The reports became the archives. The archives became the source material for the historians of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The original origin of the structures, which had been openly discussed in the older travel literature of the 17th and 18th centuries, was quietly dropped from the modern academic discussion. German diplomats travelling through Russia in the 1630s described star fortifications in the interior that the local inhabitants attributed to a vanished civilization.
French travellers in Persia described fortifications that did not match any known historical construction, and that the local people said had always been there. German naturalists in Central Asia made the same observations. All of this was in the public literature. All of it was considered reliable reporting by the standards of the time. And all of it was systematically removed from the academic curriculum in the late 19th century. The textbooks were rewritten. The older travel literature stopped being translated. The inherited structures were reattributed to recent named engineers. A generation of historians was trained to repeat the new official line. Within a century, the lie had become history, and the actual history had become the kind of thing that only people considered outside serious academic discourse were willing to discuss. Fort Wood sits in this larger context. The 11-pointed star at the base of the Statue of Liberty is not an oddity created by an engineer who had an unusual moment and never returned to it. It is a visible piece of an inherited global network of monumental construction whose origin the modern academic establishment has collectively decided not to examine. It connects by its geometry and its alignment and the quality of its masonry to the star fortifications of Tartaria and the inherited colonial defences of the Spanish Americas and the ancient harbour structures of the Mediterranean. And the people who placed the Statue of Liberty on top of it knew exactly what they were placing it on. They chose this site from all the available sites in New York Harbor because of what was already here. Because the 11-pointed star was already here. Because the symbolic tradition they were working in required placing their monument at a site already marked with the geometry of that tradition. The public-facing story, the gift from France, the symbol of immigration and freedom, and the huddled masses, was the layer of meaning they applied for general consumption. The actual meaning was the marker placed at the entrance to the harbour of the most powerful nation of the New World, in the same iconographic language that had been used to mark major harbours in the ancient world. The lighthouse goddess at the harbour entrance. The seven-rayed crown of the solar tradition, the torch of illumined knowledge. The 11-pointed star beneath her feet, connecting the whole monument to the global network of inherited construction that the official history has spent 2 centuries pretending does not exist. 12 million people a year visit this monument. They look up at the face, they photograph the torch, they read about freedom and immigration and the promise of America. Almost none of them looks down. Almost none of them counts the points of the star beneath her feet. Almost none of them asks why the same engineer who built pentagons everywhere else built an 11-pointed star here and only here, and never explained why. Almost none of them knows that the cornerstone of the pedestal was laid with Masonic ritual, attended by hundreds of Masons in formal regalia, and reported openly in the newspapers. Almost none of them knows that the designer of the figure originally intended it for the entrance to the Suez Canal as a lighthouse goddess and reused the design for New York. Almost none of them knows that the 7-rayed crown, the torch and the tablet speak a symbolic language that has nothing to do with American democracy and everything to do with an initiatory tradition that predates the United States by centuries. The monument is the same monument it has always been. The evidence is the same evidence it has always been. The 11 points are still there. The geometry has not changed. The Masonic cornerstone ceremony is in the public record. The original design concept for an Egyptian lighthouse goddess is documented in Bartholdi's own papers. None of this is hidden. All of it is accessible. What has been hidden is the invitation to look at these things together, to count the corners, to ask the engineer's question, to follow the symbolic language to its actual source. The Statue of Liberty was never only about freedom. It is something older and more specific than that. And the 11-pointed star at her feet is the most visible evidence in the most visited monument in the world that the story we have been told about what we built and why we built it and what was already here when we arrived is not the complete story. It is not even close to the complete story. The complete story begins where the official tour ends. It begins when you stop looking at the